Everybody. My name is Cara Bell, and I am the Public Relations Officer for the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women. And I am so happy to have you join us this afternoon with our guest speaker, Cleta Mitchell. Here at the Center for Conservative Women, our mission is to prepare women for effective leadership and to promote leading conservative women. Our materials, programs, and initiatives support ideas and efforts that are pro-America, pro-family, support free enterprise and entrepreneurship, and we encourage our supporters and students to be active ambassadors of conservative philosophy at their school, at their workplace, and within their community. If you are interested in learning more about the Center for Conservative Women, I invite you to visit our website, cplwomen.org, or reach out to us to get our monthly email newsletters. So, all right, we can jump on into our webinar. Introducing Cleta Mitchell is a summer fellow of ours, Autumn Klein. A rising sophomore at Nova Southeastern University, Autumn is studying computer science, IT, and math, and is an active leader on her campus. And we are so happy to have her here with us this summer.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am very excited to be introducing our speaker, Cleta Mitchell. Ms. Mitchell is a partner and political law attorney in the Washington, D.C. office of Foley & Lardner, LLP, and a member of the firm's political law practice. With over 40 years of experience, she advises nonprofit and issue organizations, candidates, campaigns, and individuals on state and federal campaign finance law, election law, and compliance issues. She practices before the Federal Election Commission, the ethics committees of the U.S. House and Senate, as well as similar state and local enforcement bodies and agencies. Ms. Mitchell represents numerous candidates, campaigns, and members of Congress, as well as state and national political party committees. She has served as legal counsel to the National Republican Senatorial Committee and the National Republican Congressional Committee. Ms. Mitchell served as co-counsel for the National Rifle Association in the Supreme Court case involving the 2002 federal campaign finance law. Our organization, the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women, awarded her with our annual Woman of the Year Award in 2013. She is a force for transparency and fairness and an inspiration to many young women like myself. Today, Ms. Mitchell will be discussing the loopholes in the left's mail-in ballot system and how susceptible our election turnouts could become without photo ID and in-person voting. Please join me in welcoming Cleta Mitchell.
Well, thank you all so much. It's great to be with you, and it's fun to be able to talk about the election year and what's happening and some issues around that. Let me just give you a little bit of a preface. First of all, I love doing things with the Center for Conservative Women and Claire Booth Luce Women Center because it is a great organization. It has helped so many young conservative women on campuses and in high schools across America to be able to know that they're not crazy and that when they're trying to be silenced, they're suffering from the effort to silence them by the leftists on campus, that actually there are a lot of other people who share their views and they're not, and you're not wrong. You may be outnumbered, but you're not wrong. And so it's a great thing to have the work of the Center for Conservative Women and the Claire Booth Luce Public Policy Center working so hard to lift up young women all over the country, as it has done for many, many years. So I hope you take to heart all the lessons and things that the Center for Conservative Women has to offer. I always love speaking to and with and hearing from the center and all of the wonderful young women associated with it. So today we're going to talk about the elections. We're going to talk about election integrity and how we protect the integrity of America's elections when they are under assault. And let me just give you a little bit of background. It used to be that the government did not print ballots. For the beginning part of the nation's history, the ballots were actually printed and handed out and delivered and counted by political parties, political party bosses. And early in the 20th century, there came to be an effort, interestingly, pushed by the progressive movement in the early 20th century, to take the control of elections out of the hands of party bosses and political and campaign operatives and move all of that machinery out of the political parties and into the hands of government at agencies where you had hopefully you would train election officials, and that they would be nonpartisan. And that isn't always the case, we know that, but the theory was that we should not allow the political parties to control the election process. Political parties could control the campaign process, but we needed to separate. That was the argument. America needed to separate the campaigning from the election machinery itself. And one of the manifestations of that was literally to adopt what was called the Australian ballot. The Australian ballot means that the country of Australia was the first country that actually decided that the government should print the ballots, distribute the ballots, collect the ballots, count the ballots, rather than party bosses. And so that was done in the early part of the 20th century, where America began to institute within the states. And now remember, the process of conducting elections is not a federal procedure. It is under the U.S. Constitution. It is delegated to the states. The states are responsible for conducting the elections, or states are responsible for what the Constitution says, the time, place, and manner of electing even the federal officials. So that's why we have 50 state laws that govern the election process. Who qualifies as a candidate? How do you qualify as a candidate? When are the elections held? How everything about the elections are to be conducted. So that's a state, that's a province of the states. And what we are seeing now, and it started, say, 20 years ago when Bill Clinton was president, and the national motor voter law was passed. And that was one of the very first things that the Clinton administration wanted to get done. It's always interesting to me when Democrats and leftists are elected, the first thing they do is they start messing with the process, the political process. When Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House in 2007, the first thing that was in order on her agenda was a major overhaul, she said, of the federal lobbying law. They didn't really change very much, frankly. We're just tweaking around the edges, but that was the very first bill. When the Democrats took over Congress in the 2018 election, H.R. 1 in 2019, it was a massive 2,000+ page bill to rewrite the election laws, to federalize the elections, to rewrite campaign finance laws, to change all kinds of things related to political process. It's something the left is fixated upon, is always trying to manipulate and rewrite the process in hopes of changing the outcome. So what we are seeing now in 2020 is a situation where there are over 100 lawsuits, most of them filed by lawyers for the Democratic National Committee, who are funded by George Soros and other left-wing groups and donors, to force states through the courts to have their election laws rewritten. And not by the legislatures. The legislatures already have written laws, but trying to force changes in the statutes by judges without true adversary proceeding. So let me just go through some of the things I've talked about. One of the things you hear a lot about after 2016, remember, oh, well, there was all this Russian interference in the election. Really? I think it was finally confirmed that somehow some Russian bots posted something like $100,000 of ads on Facebook. Does anybody believe that changed the outcome of the 2016 election? No, it did not. It had no impact. However, that has been used as a pretext was the pretext for getting Facebook and Twitter and all the big tech companies to either say they're not going to allow any political conversation or ads, or to try to strip those big tech platforms from any election-related communications. Of course, that really ends up only applying to conservatives. So it's a silencing of conservative views, which they deem to be hate speech. If we say we believe that America is not a racist country, they deem that to be hate speech. I believe that America is a wonderful country. That would be deemed hate speech by the big tech companies. And so we've seen all of the pressure to silence conservatives on election and political related issues and statements. But what we've also seen is an effort by, as I said, these lawsuits that have been filed all over the country to change the election laws. And now, instead of it being, we have to stop foreign interference in elections, now they have pivoted. And now the concern is, or the supposed concern is, because of COVID-19, we have to completely upend the election laws of the states. And here are some of the things that have been brought to the courts to demand. So, number one, we know that over the last decade, we no longer have an election day. The Constitution provides for an election day, and that is set by federal law as the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November. And that's when all federal candidates are to be elected. That's when you're supposed to have the election. Well, we know that beginning about 10 or 15 years ago, that states began to allow early voting, and some states on the West Coast have moved to eliminate their polling places altogether, and now have all mail voting in Oregon, in Washington State, and now in Colorado. Now, what does that mean for our democracy? It means that we're not all operating under the same set of information when we cast our ballots. Ballots will start being cast in many places in mid-September. And so if something happens in October, well, the people who've already voted have lost their ability to make a decision based on the same information as a neighbor in another state may have, or as a neighbor in their own state may have based their decision upon because they didn't vote until election day. So we've seen that change. And the big issue that is being raised today in the court cases and hammering by the left and by the Democrats today is the rush to all mail, M-A-I-L, mail voting in every state. That's one of the things that was included in this H.R. 1. That's one of the things that was a provision that was included in the pandemic CARES Act that Congress, the legislation that Nancy Pelosi introduced in response to the pandemic. And their argument is, well, people are not going to be able to leave their homes, so we have to have all mail voting. Well, let me just say, there are so many things wrong with that premise. Let's start with this fact. The New York Times did a study and wrote an article about 8 years ago in which it acknowledged that with an increase in mail voting in some states and across the country, that the ability of election officials to monitor and ensure the integrity of the ballot and the election outcomes was greatly diminished. When you have mail voting, what you have is mail, you have voting where there really are not able to ensure that the safeguards to protect the integrity of the election, to guard against fraud, to guard against those who would want to unduly pressure the most vulnerable populations, whether it's the elderly, whether it's people with somewhat diminished mental capacity, people who live in group homes, people who live in assisted living facilities, that there's really no way for the laws that are on the books to protect those populations, those voting populations, there's no way those can be enforced. But there's this enormous national push by the media, by the left, to impose all mail voting. Now, one of the things that that brings to mind is, well, doesn't that assume that the U.S. Post Office is able to process on a timely basis all of the ballots? If everybody is asking for a ballot and voting by mail, what is going to happen with the Postal Service? Well, let me give you some examples. The Postal Service Office of Inspector General just did a study, released a study of the 2018 election, the off-year election, and special elections since then. And they did their goal. Let me just say this: their goal, the Post Office has established a goal to only lose 4% of the ballots. Now think about that. Their goal is not to make sure that 100% of the ballots are received timely, processed, and returned timely to the election facility so that they can be received, processed, and counted timely. Their goal is to make sure that 96% of the ballots are received timely and returned timely. So that's their goal. That's their stated goal. How many millions of ballots does that represent? The Election Assistance Commission did a study over several cycles and found that there were literally millions of ballots that either were misdelivered, were delivered well after the deadline, or never delivered. Millions of ballots. Now, if the Post Office tells the public we have a goal of only losing 4% of your votes, and we did not meet that goal. We got close, but it's actually closer to 5% that we know that the Post Office admits they did not process in time for that voter's vote to be counted. Now, the left always says that we have to make sure that every single vote is counted. I agree with that. We want every legally eligible voter to have the certainty that his or her ballot is going to be counted, and that his or her expression of his or her opinion and through his or her vote is counted. Mail balloting does not ensure that. And in fact, the system for returning the ballots is proven that they cannot handle and ensure that 100% of the voters' ballots will actually be received, returned, and delivered on time to be counted. So that we start with that. That's a big problem. So a few months ago, actually, a number of us watching all of the issues that have been presented in all this different litigation, we assembled a task force of election law experts from across the country, attorneys, election officials, people who have scholars, secretaries of state, and we collectively put together a list of what we call the standards for voting by mail. If you are going to, and every state has some system for voting by mail. And so what we wanted to do as a group of people who've been involved in this arena for a long time, wanted to collectively assemble our experience and our beliefs and our thoughts, and we generated and produced in June some national standards for voting by mail. And I think we may have those available to post on the screen. Do we have those? In any event, there are a number of issues that relate to these issues. The first one is there they are. So here are the historically what we wanted people to understand is that voting by mail compromises the election system. That anytime you are going to remove the voting process from the immediate personal scrutiny of election officials, you run the risk of creating problems, fraud, and lost ballots. We know that they are that votes by mail are historically vulnerable to intimidation, manipulation, fraud, and chaos. In New York, the New York primary, there are races from the New York primary in June where we still do not know the outcome, almost a little more than a month later. Now, one of the things that most election laws put in place, laws that have been enacted by the legislature, is to create certainty, an absolute certainty. There's a time, and to have absolute certainty of the election results. So one of the things that mail voting does not allow for is immediate information, determination of the results, and certainty of the results. And it's really important that we pay attention to that, particularly in a presidential election where the electors and the Electoral College meet. They're going to meet barely a month after the election. We cannot afford to have a situation where the Electoral College cannot meet on its required constitutional date because they're still trying to locate, find, and process absentee ballots or ballots by mail. So this is a huge problem. We also cite in these standards examples going back to many years and even in recent elections where big buckets of absentee ballots were found in an apartment building near the trash can in Nevada, where an entire set of elections in Miami-Dade County was set aside because of a massive fraud scheme that was involved with the absentee ballots and the voting by mail. So here are the 4 principles. If you look in that box there on the screen, there are 4 principles that are really important for all of the mail voting. Number 1, election officials must not automatically mail ballots to everyone on the voter rolls. One of the things that we know from a number of years and many, many studies is that the voter rolls themselves are not kept up by the election officials. They are not current. In many cases, they are a mess. They have many more people on the rolls than there are eligible adults, a voting age population in that jurisdiction, so that you have more people on the rolls than who actually live there and can vote. And if a jurisdiction, if a county election board or a state mandates just sending ballots to everybody on the rolls, guess what? They're going to be sending ballots to a lot of dead people. They're going to be sending multiple ballots to a single address because some people may have moved. If you're in an apartment building, you may have a person living in that apartment may receive 4 or 5 or 6 ballots. Now, you tell me, isn't that a huge opportunity for fraud? Particularly if you don't have safeguards in place so that the person who's sending back the ballot has to have some identifying information, some process to know that that's actually the voter who's eligible to vote there. So number 1, we must not have jurisdictions sending ballots automatically to, no, move that back down, please. Can you do that? Yeah, move it back down. I want to see that, that box. There we go, right there. I want everybody to see that box. Nope, 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 it's moving again. Okay, there we go. Leave it there. All right, so we don't want to have automatic mailing of ballots. That's just, that's a recipe for fraud, disaster. Secondly, there has to be a process for safeguarding the return of the ballots. That's a hugely important principle. There are those who want to set up, in fact, one of the things that the post office says is, well, we can't process properly all these ballots, so maybe we'll just set up a receptacle and people can just drop their ballots in this receptacle rather than having them go through the mail process. The big problem with that is that those receptacles can be stuffed, They can be stolen. They can be manipulated, and there's not necessarily a way for the postal authorities to, if you do that, there's no way for the postal authorities to postmark every envelope that contains a returned ballot. So there has to be a way to make certain that there is a way to return any mail ballot that is secure and that makes certain that it includes some way to identify that the person who sent the ballot is actually that registered voter. The counting process. So we have, don't send it out. Number one principle, don't just mail ballots to everybody. Number two principle is the return of the ballots. The manner in which that's done has to have certain safeguards that make sure that it comes from the ballot, from the voter to the election official, to the election office, which means this is another thing that many of these lawsuits are trying to get done. They are trying to get courts to allow campaign workers, or really anybody, to go around and collect ballots. Well, that is also an opportunity for fraud. Many, and if not most states, have a requirement that only the voter or a personal representative of the voter, immediate family member, can return a ballot for a voter. So either I have to return my own ballot, or if I'm disabled, that a family member or somebody who has been given authority by me to return my ballot can return a ballot for me. But the campaign can't come along and collect ballots and turn those in. We've seen cases. In fact, the Heritage Foundation has just published a study of 4 different cases showing the fraud that has happened when, with regard to returned ballots. And in fact, one of those cases was in North Carolina, where a political operative had copied over a period of years signatures of voters. So he was able to then use those signatures to pretend and to essentially, to defraud the voter by saying that by returning ballots in what is called ballot harvesting. He was harvesting their ballots and returning them, collecting them and returning them and making sure that they were voted the way he wanted them to be voted. So we have to, ballot harvesting is a huge problem. Most states prohibit it, but the Democrats have filed lawsuits in a number of states to invalidate those laws that prohibit ballot harvesting. And I will say this, the U.S. House of Representatives House Administration Committee, the minority ranking member of that committee, Representative Rodney Davis, just released a study a few weeks ago that looked at what happened in California in 2018. And what had happened was California had changed its law to allow ballot harvesting. And what they found was that political operatives went around after the election, figured out who hadn't voted, got people to vote, and turned in literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ballots by political campaigns, bringing it to the election officials, so that elections that had been determined on election day within another week, after all these massive ballot harvesting caches of ballots were located, surprisingly, amazingly, and delivered to the election officials, it switched the outcome of the election from Republicans to Democrats. It is one of the ways that the Democrats retook control of the House of Representatives. So I guess that would be a good reason why we would see them wanting to have federal legislation allowing ballot harvesting in all 50 states, mandating ballot harvesting, and why they're suing all over the country to force judges to invalidate the laws that prohibit ballot harvesting and to allow them to basically do what it says, figure out who the voters are that may not have voted, take ballots to them, get them to vote, collect them, return them after the election. Because one of the other things they're trying to do in many of these lawsuits is get rid of the, or extend the deadlines for the return of ballots. Most states say that if you vote an absentee ballot, you have to have sent it in time that it is in the election office by the close of election day so that it can be counted along with all of the other ballots. And they're trying in a number of cases to get judges to say, oh no, you can have longer to return your ballot. And that's one of the reasons they want to be able to have those two things, to be able to go collect more ballots after the election when they see what the races are, where they need more votes, and then get ballots voted, collect them and return them and change the outcome of the election. I think that's fraud, and I hope that, and so far a number of judges who've been asked to do those two things, to allow ballot harvesting and extend the deadlines. So far, we're doing pretty well in terms of those of us who believe in election integrity, and the judges are not allowing those cases to go forward. So we'll see what happens with that. You just moved it again. Whoops, it's gone. Can you bring it back up? Okay, and we need to go back to the box. Can you do that? There we go. All right, the third thing that is really an important principle in voting by mail is that there has to be a way, when the ballots are returned to the election office, that there's a way to compare either a signature or a voter ID number or last four digits of a social security number, or some cases, some people have proposed a thumbprint, that some way to match that the ballot that's being returned belongs to the registered voter, so that you don't have people voting somebody else's ballot. So that's number one. The processing of ballots needs to be transparent so that there's a way for citizens. I mean, I'm a big believer in there's a proper role for campaign and political party operatives to observe what is happening in the election process, whether it's observing the counting, being able to challenge the composition of a ballot prior to it being finalized, lots of things like that. What I don't want to see, and what those of us who believe in election integrity, what we don't want to see is, we don't want to see us backslide as states and as a country to the days where the political parties and the party bosses and the political operatives are the ones who are actually controlling the election machinery. So I'm a big believer in having the ability of campaign representatives to observe what the election officials are doing in terms of processing the ballots, and that so that there is transparency. And let's say this, that somehow there's a determination that this particular ballot is invalid. I think there needs to be a way to notify the voter and to say, we have, your ballot has been challenged. Can you verify your identity? So that you can make sure that a voter who sent a ballot in and believes that everything is fine, they ought to have a chance to say, well, no, that really was mine. But they also ought to know if somebody's voting in their name and it wasn't their ballot. And that happens a lot, where people show up at the polls and find out that they've already been marked as having voted when they haven't voted at all. So there has to be a way that there, in the counting, that there is, it's secure, that it's transparent, and also that it's happened in advance. I mean, that we need to make sure that the moment the polls close, that ballots, whether it's they're cast in a precinct or a polling place or cast by mail, are counted immediately. And so we, again, go back to having the certainty that we need insofar as the outcome of the election. And finally, I think it's an important principle that we don't want to see a situation where I don't believe that all mail voting is an appropriate manner of conducting elections. And I know some states have done it. Oregon is one of the states that has adopted all mail voting. I'm not sure I want to emulate Oregon. And for those of you who may be from Oregon, I apologize, but the system in Oregon has produced ever far more progressive left-wing elected officials, and I think we're seeing that play out in Portland right now. And so I think that those of us who believe in election integrity believe that it's an important principle that we should actually always continue to have an election day, and that we should always have polling places for people to be able to go to the polls and cast their ballots as a civic-minded person who wants to vote on election day. And I know a lot of people who say, I like to vote on election day, and that's how I've always voted, and that's how I want to vote. And I think that's an important civic exercise for our country, and we should always make sure that we don't ever eliminate the ability of citizens to vote on election day. And finally, let me just say this. There's always been this discussion in the last 4 years about how we want to eliminate foreign interference in our elections. Let me tell you the #1 way in which there is foreign interference in our elections, and that is where election officials do not make certain that only citizens of the United States are casting ballots in their jurisdiction. We all know that I started mentioning with the motor voter bill, where when we go to get a driver's license or you go to a certain agency, social service agencies, that they have to ask you, they have to register you to vote. Well, not everybody who goes to the social services agencies for low-income assistance, and not everybody who goes to get a driver's license is a citizen of the United States. And those voter registrations come back from the Department of Motor Vehicles and the social service agencies, and they get dumped into the voter registration rolls. And many of those are not eligible. It is a federal crime to register to vote in a federal election if you are not a U.S. citizen. It is an additional federal crime if you're not a U.S. citizen to cast a ballot in a federal election. And it's important for election integrity, for the election officials to make certain that they run those lists that come back from Motor Voter or other sources, and make sure that they run those against the list so that they make sure that they're citizens. They make sure that people who are not eligible under state law to vote, some states have different rules about who's eligible, and those election officials are supposed to, under federal law, clean their voter rolls. They're supposed to run their lists against the National Change of Address database. I mean, there is the post office does maintain a National Change of Address system, and there is, the Social Security Administration has the deaths. People are required by law to notify the Social Security Administration of the death of a loved one, and there are databases that local officials and state officials can run their lists against to make certain that only those who are legally eligible to vote should be on the voter rolls. But in particular, it's important that if you're worried about foreign interference in a U.S. election, the #1 interference is when you have non-citizens voting in our elections. So these are all things that may sound dry and not important, but they're very important if we're going to maintain the integrity of the elections. And now I will close with one request. One of the things that's going to be badly needed in 2020 are people who are willing to say, I will work the polls, I will go to the training, I will help with the processing of the mail ballots. We are going to need young people who are willing to go and be trained and willing to work the election and be part of the election machinery. So I urge you, if you want to find something that you could do as a citizen to help with the election process and make sure that you help prevent fraud in the elections where you live, I would urge you to contact your election board, say, I'd like to be an election official. They will train you. They'll be excited to have young people saying that they're willing to work. You get paid, not very much, but I urge you to consider becoming not a poll watcher, but an election judge, election poll worker in the 2020 elections. So with that, I'm happy to stop and answer questions.
Thank you so much, Cleta, for taking the time to be here with us. I definitely, personally, don't think that this topic is dry at all. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. And so I'm just very thankful that, you know, maybe I'm speaking on behalf of just the two of us, but it is very interesting, and I love that you're here to join us. So you mentioned that, you know, there are election officials registering illegal immigrants or non-citizens is a federal crime. But what are the consequences for election officials if they're caught registering non-citizens? And because it's a federal crime, it's very serious, but are any of these people actually charged? Are their license stripped away? Are you aware of the type of action that's taken against this to prevent it in the future?
Well, there have been cases where, in fact, I know of cases pending in North Carolina where a group of citizens went through and looked at the voter rolls, and it's a very tedious process. They did it after the election, and they turned over to district attorneys across the state of North Carolina after the 2016 election the names of people who had registered and voted who were not citizens, and or who were otherwise ineligible under North Carolina law to be able to vote in the election. And some of those were prosecuted and some were not. You know, it's left to the local prosecutors. And I do think that I wish that there was an effort by the Department of Justice to say, you know, these are the laws and we will prosecute people who violate the laws. Now, I will, you know, the other thing I'll say is there's also a concern that I have, which is that when somebody goes to the DMV, driver's license, and an official of the Department of Motor Vehicles says, would you like to register to vote? There is a place on the form that says that they're, whether they are or not a citizen, although some liberal groups have challenged that. They don't want it to even be on the form. And it would be appropriate for the people at the Department of Motor Vehicles to say, if you are not a citizen, you should not register because you can't register. Are you a citizen? That would be the easy way to handle it if those who are handing out these voter registration forms would say, are you a citizen? But the left doesn't want those questions asked because they want to pollute the voter rolls of people who are ineligible. And it's very hard to, in some cases, get prosecutors to prosecute those who have violated the law. And it takes a lot of tedious work to identify those who are registered when they shouldn't be, and then to see if they voted when they shouldn't have. But the Public Interest Legal Foundation is an election integrity 501c3 public interest law firm, and they're just in the process of getting ready to release a report that shows the number of dead voters, the number of duplicate votes, the number of non-citizen votes that were cast during the 2016 and 2018 elections. So I think that that would be very useful, perhaps to law enforcement and prosecutors, and maybe get some attention of some election officials that they need to do a better job of cleaning their voter rolls.
Right, and I was very shocked to see, and a lot of our viewers were also very shocked to hear that only 4% of ballot, the post office goal is only to lose 4% of ballots, which 4% is actually quite a lot. And then I read later in the document, it said that 28 million mail-in ballots were never returned or counted as of the last 4 federal elections. And so we have this problem of a lot of ballots not even being counted, but we also have the problem of a lot of ballots being sent to people that aren't even alive, or in some cases a person's cat. And so in the document you mentioned, step 1 is to clean the voter rolls of the dead, non-citizens, and relocated registrants. This is a massive administrative undertaking by the state. And to be completely honest, do you believe it's even a realistic goal? Because I understand, from an administrative standpoint, a lot of your records are clean after 5 or 7 to 10 years. but we're talking about for an entire state. So is this a realistic goal?
Well, it's the federal law requires it. That's the problem, is that the federal law requires that they are supposed to clean the voter rolls. And it's done at mostly it's done at the local level. It's by county, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. That's where the voter rolls are maintained. They may be uploaded into a state database, but the maintenance of the voter lists is normally conducted by the counties or by the local jurisdictions. And look, I mean, they always say they don't have enough money, but the fact is Congress just appropriated billions of dollars. I think it was like $4 billion to the state, to the Election Assistance Commission just this spring for grants to the states to deal with COVID-related issues. Well, the very first COVID-related issue is let's get the voter rolls cleaned up. And those have to be done by a week from Monday because under federal law, you can't change the voter rolls within 90 days of an election. And so this is the kind of thing that should be done immediately starting after the election in the odd numbered year, and to make sure that those rolls are ready to go when you get into the election cycle. Into the election year, but they don't do it. They say they don't have the money, and it's just never been a priority. But in addition to that, when they start trying to clean the rolls, there are a dozen left-wing groups who come in and sue them, saying that it's voter suppression. In my home state of Oklahoma, the law used to be that if you had not voted in any election for 4 years or more, you were moved to you're moved off the rolls. You're moved to inactive status. And that is deemed now by left-wing groups to somehow be voter suppression. Well, it's not voter suppression. It moves. If I don't want to vote, I don't think it should be mandatory to vote. Australia has, not everybody cites Australia as high voter participation. Well, that's because it's mandatory. If you don't do it, you get fined. So yes, they have higher participation, but I don't think it should be mandatory. But if I choose not to vote, then my name should not be on the rolls as an active voter. And we now see that playing out as to why it's such a bad idea to keep inactive voters on the rolls, because now we have these efforts to mail ballots to everybody that's on the rolls. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I received a few years ago, I have a voter registration card. I carry it with me. And I always present it. But believe me, in Washington, D.C., they say, no, we can't take that. We can't take that. They don't even want any proof of identity. You're supposed to walk up and say your name. But they sent me, I received it in the mail, something that was on typing paper. This is your new voter registration card. It was on typing paper. And so I was talking to some friends, one of whom was a young woman who worked on Capitol Hill, lived in an apartment. She got 10 of them, all to different people who had previously lived at her apartment. If she wanted to, she could go vote at different locations around the city in early voting 10 times. Now, if you live in Washington, D.C., you don't really have much option of anybody to vote for if you're a conservative. But that just tells you of how insane the system is of not keeping clean voter rolls. And who knows what prompted the DC government to decide to send out on typing paper all these little pieces of paper to people to be able to say, this is your new voter registration card. And there were people who had moved out of the district years earlier, and yet they were receiving those voter cards. So it's a big problem. It's a problem all over the country, and it's because the left has treated as villains any election officials who say we've got to clean up the voter rolls. And those of us who try to argue that and work on cleaning the voter rolls, we're villains as well.
You just can't win, huh? So we're going to sidestep, and one of our attendees asked the question, what about the issue now being raised that the return mail postage for mail ballots may constitute a violation of the poll tax amendment?
that having to put postage on, they have to put postage on a ballot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, that would be an argument. If somebody believes that, well, then they should be against voting by mail and just say everybody has to show up. And, you know, in a lot of states, the only way you can vote absentee is if you have an excuse. You're going to be out of the jurisdiction on election day. You are in the hospital. You know, you're infirmed. Any one of a number of things like that. But, you know, I don't think that's a poll tax, but I think that those who are promoting that everybody ought to vote by mail ought to think about that. The other thing too is people say, well, then there should be postage paid by prepaid postage put on the ballots, so for the return carrier, so that nobody has to pay for that. Well, here's the problem with doing that. If you're going to make sure that a ballot has been postmarked when it is returned, it's not going to be postmarked again when the person, if they've received and they have a prepaid postage, those are not going to be stamps. They're going to be run through postage meters with a date that is the date when it's sent to the voter. The voter needs to put it back in an envelope, a carrier, and have that stamped and postmarked for the return. And if you prepay all the postage and predate the return, you're never going to know whether that ballot was legitimately sent and received. Maybe it was sent before the date of the election. Maybe it's not received until the next day, or in some states there's a leeway that if it's postmarked by election day, they'll count it. Well, how are you going to do that if it's already gotten postmarked when it was sent to the voter in the first place? So I think that's, yeah, it creates another problem, but that's why I think that we ought to be very hesitant about going to massive voting by mail.
Right. And this will be our final question. It's from one of our summer fellows here. And she asks, has voter fraud consistently gotten worse, or are we just noticing it more?
Well, I think that there's always, you know, with any human enterprise, there are always people who want to game the system. There are always people who want to break the rules. And so as a matter of, you know, percentages, I think that there are different levels of irregularities and fraud depending on where the election is being held. But I guess I would just close with saying this. I started out with talking about the changes in election administration in the early part of the 20th century. The whole point of those changes was to remove the ability of party bosses and party operatives and workers to demand the votes of people who were not able to decide for themselves. So the idea of the secret ballot, that protects people from being influenced by their bosses or by political operatives. The ability of the election machinery to be held by the government, conducted by the government, and let the campaigns observe it, do what they do in the campaign, but separate those two things. And what I think is happening now is that all of those advances that were made in the early part of the 20th century to protect the integrity of the ballot, to protect the vulnerable, so that they could vote in secret, they could vote the way they felt they wanted to vote, that they wouldn't be pressured by partisans. All of that now is being stripped away through these legal actions by the lefts and by the Democrats, and they're doing all of this under the guise of protecting the right to vote. They're actually diminishing the protections on the right to vote, and that's what we have to be vigilant to try to stop.
Great. And as a way to wrap up, what final advice do you have for our listeners and young college-age conservative women across the country to remain as champions for conservative philosophy at their schools and to promote just elections?
Well, I think that first of all, you have to remember you're not alone. And that's the great thing about the Center for Conservative Women, that I always come back to that. You always know you have a home there. And I would say, you know, look, you're not alone. You have to be strong. You're up against a mob. But just stick to your principles and be strong in your faith, be strong in your commitment to your principles and your country, and get involved. I come back to, if you really want to help to protect the integrity of America's elections in 2020, call your local election officials, say you want to work the polls, take 5 friends with you. It's something that you should start doing, and we need you, and we hope you'll do that.
Thank you so much, Cleta, for having us or joining us today. And to all the attendees listening right now, I'll be sure to send you the recording of our video today, as well as the document that Cleta shared with us. So thank you. We hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you, Cleta.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.